The cast iron skillet flew through the air with deadly precision, its blackened surface catching the flickering lamplight as it spun end over end towards Chef Donald Garcia's head. Time seemed suspended in that moment, the entire kitchen holding its breath as 20 years of tyranny hung in the balance. The pan struck him square in the forehead with a resounding clang that echoed through the cramped galley like a church bell tolling the end of an era. Donald Garcia staggered backward, his massive frame swaying as blood trickled down his face. His eyes, usually blazing with fury, now held something foreign, something that had never been seen in the kitchens of the merchant vessel Prosperity. Fear. For the first time in his brutal career, the man who had terrorized countless cooks, who had broken spirits and crushed dreams with his iron fist and scalding tongue, stood speechless. Maria Campbell stood defiantly before him, her pregnant belly protruding beneath her grease-stained apron, her dark eyes blazing with a fire that matched his own. Her chest heaved with exertion and emotion as she clutched another pan in her trembling hands, ready to launch it if he dared to move toward her. The kitchen around them bore witness to years of his cruelty, the scarred wooden surfaces, the dented pots, the atmosphere thick with the memory of broken dreams and shattered confidence. "Cook it yourself," she had said. Those four simple words that had never been spoken to Donald Garcia in his 20-year reign of terror aboard merchant ships, words that hung in the air like a challenge to everything he had built his reputation upon. The other kitchen staff, three young men who had cowered under his abuse for months, stood frozen in amazement, their eyes wide with disbelief at what they had just witnessed. The blood continued to flow down Donald's face as he touched the growing lump on his forehead. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, his usual torrent of profanity and threats nowhere to be found. The silence stretched on, broken only by the gentle creaking of the ship and the distant sound of waves against the hull. Maria's breathing gradually slowed, but her grip on the pan remained firm, her stance unwavering. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The confrontation between Maria and Donald had been building for weeks, a storm-gathering force in the cramped quarters below deck where the ship's meals were prepared under conditions that would have challenged even the most experienced cooks. But to understand how a pregnant woman came to face down the most feared chef on the Atlantic shipping routes, we must go back to where it all began. 3 months earlier, the merchant vessel Prosperity had docked in the bustling port of Boston, its cargo holds full of textiles and manufactured goods bound for European markets. The ship was a floating city of sorts, carrying not just merchandise but the dreams and desperation of those seeking passage across the ocean. Among the crew quarters and passenger cabins, the kitchen stood as perhaps the most important space on the vessel, for it was here that sustenance was provided for the long journey ahead. Donald Garcia had ruled these kitchens for 5 years, having worked his way up through sheer brutality and an iron will that brooked no opposition. He was a man carved from granite, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway. His face bore the scars of countless kitchen accidents and more than a few fights. His hands were massive and calloused from years of wielding knives and lifting heavy pots. But it was his temper that truly defined him, a volcanic rage that could erupt without warning, leaving destruction in its wake. The stories of his cruelty were legendary among the shipping community. He had once thrown a pot of boiling soup at a young cook who had oversalted the broth, leaving the boy with scars that would mark him for life. Another time, he had locked a kitchen assistant in the ship's cold storage for 6 hours because the man had dared to suggest a different seasoning for the evening stew. Crew members spoke in whispers of the 3 cooks who had jumped ship in various ports rather than endure another day under his tyrannical rule. His method was simple and effective. Break them down completely, strip away every shred of confidence and self-worth, then rebuild them in his own image. Those who survived became extensions of his will, moving through the kitchen like automatons, anticipating his needs, fearing his wrath, never daring to question his methods or his authority. The turnover rate in his kitchen was astronomical, but the shipping company tolerated it because Donald Garcia could feed 200 people with military precision, and his meals, while prepared under conditions of terror, were consistently excellent. The kitchen itself reflected his personality. Every surface was scrubbed to a shine that bordered on the obsessive, every pot and pan arranged with mathematical precision. Woe to the cook who left so much as a water spot on a ladle or failed to return a utensil to its designated location. The punishment would be swift and merciless, ranging from verbal abuse that could reduce grown men to tears to physical violence that left lasting marks. When Maria Campbell first walked into his domain that September morning, Donald Garcia took one look at her expanding waistline and nearly laughed out loud. She was perhaps 5 feet 6 inches tall, with long dark hair that she kept braided and pinned back, and a face that spoke of quiet determination despite her obvious condition. Her pregnancy was clearly visible, probably 6 months along, and she moved with the careful deliberation of a woman carrying precious cargo. "What is this?" Donald had said, his voice dripping with contempt. "They send me a pregnant woman to work in my kitchen. Do they think this is some kind of charity operation?" He had circled her like a predator, sizing up prey, his eyes taking in every detail of her appearance, looking for weaknesses to exploit. Maria had stood her ground, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes meeting his without flinching. "I can work," she had said simply. "I need this job." The other kitchen staff, 3 young men named Matthew Nelson, Daniel Green, and Brandon Garcia, had watched this exchange with a mixture of fascination and horror. They had all been through Donald's initiation process, that brutal first week where he systematically destroyed whatever confidence they had brought with them. Matthew, barely 20 years old, still bore a scar on his left hand from where Donald had slammed it in a drawer for being too slow with the vegetables. Daniel, a thin, nervous boy from the Irish countryside, had developed a stutter that only appeared when Donald was nearby. Brandon, despite sharing the chef's surname, had received no special treatment and carried himself with the hunched shoulders of someone perpetually expecting a blow. "You need this job," Donald had repeated, his voice taking on that silky tone that always preceded his most vicious attacks. "Well, let me tell you what you need, sweetheart. You need to understand that in my kitchen there is only one rule. My rule. You do what I say, when I say it, how I say it. You speak when spoken to. You move when I tell you to move, and you never, ever question my methods. Is that clear?" Maria had nodded, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of steel that the others had lost long ago. She understood the rules, but she had not accepted them, not in the way that true submission required. Donald had seen this resistance, this tiny spark of defiance, and it had intrigued him. Breaking her would be a special pleasure, a challenge worthy of his skills. The first day had been relatively mild by Donald's standards. He had assigned her to the most menial tasks, scrubbing pots and chopping vegetables, work that was physically demanding but not beyond her capabilities. He watched her constantly, looking for signs of fatigue, for the moment when her condition would betray her and give him the opening he needed to begin his campaign of destruction. But Maria had surprised him. She worked steadily and efficiently, her movements economical and purposeful. When he barked orders at her, she responded promptly and without complaint. When he criticized her technique, she listened and adjusted without argument. She seemed to understand that this was a game of endurance, and she was prepared to play it. The other cooks watched this dance with growing amazement. They had never seen anyone last more than a few hours without breaking down under Donald's relentless pressure. Matthew whispered to Daniel during a brief break, "She is different. There is something about her that he cannot touch." Daniel had nodded nervously, glancing around to make sure Donald was not within earshot. "But he will find a way," he had replied. "He always does." As the days passed, Donald's frustration grew. He increased the pressure gradually, the way a chef might turn up the heat under a pot, waiting for the contents to reach their breaking point. He assigned Maria the heaviest lifting, the most repetitive tasks, the jobs that would tax her strength and test her resolve. He criticized everything she did, finding fault with her knife work, her timing, her very presence in his kitchen. But still, she endured. More than endured, she began to excel. Her knife work became precise and confident. Her understanding of the kitchen's rhythm grew more sophisticated each day. She learned to anticipate the needs of the service, to have ingredients prepared and ready before they were requested. Most importantly, she learned to read Donald's moods, to sense when his temper was building, and to stay out of his direct line of fire. The turning point came during the 3rd week, when the ship encountered rough seas that sent everything not bolted down sliding across the deck. The kitchen became a treacherous obstacle course of shifting pots and rolling vegetables, and the normal routine became nearly impossible to maintain. Donald's temper, always simmering just below the surface, reached a dangerous boiling point as he struggled to maintain his standards under the chaotic conditions. It was during the dinner service that everything went wrong. A particularly violent wave sent a pot of soup cascading across the galley floor, creating a slippery mess that threatened to send anyone who stepped in it tumbling into the hot stoves. Matthew, already nervous and exhausted from fighting the ship's motion all day, made the mistake of trying to clean up the spill while carrying a tray of dishes. The inevitable happened. His feet went out from under him, and he crashed to the floor in an explosion of broken crockery and scattered food. The sound echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot, and in the sudden silence that followed, everyone could hear Donald's breathing becoming deep and labored, the way it always did when his rage was building to critical mass. Matthew scrambled to his feet, his face white with terror, his hands bleeding from the broken dishes. "I am sorry," he stammered, the words tumbling over each other in his haste to get them out. "I am so sorry, Chef Garcia. It was an accident. I swear it was an accident." Donald moved toward him with the deliberate pace of an executioner approaching the scaffold. His face had taken on that terrible calm that always preceded his most violent outbursts, and his eyes fixed on Matthew with laser-like intensity. "An accident," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "In my kitchen, there are no accidents. There is only incompetence and carelessness, and the kind of stupidity that ruins everything I have worked to build." He reached for the heavy wooden spoon that he kept hanging beside the stove, the same spoon he had used to discipline countless other cooks over the years. Matthew backed away, his hands raised defensively, but there was nowhere to go in the confined space of the galley. Daniel and Brandon pressed themselves against the walls, their eyes wide with the familiar mixture of terror and relief that came from knowing they were not the target of Donald's wrath. But as Donald raised the spoon above his head, preparing to bring it down on Matthew's shoulders with enough force to leave bruises that would last for weeks, Maria stepped between them. Her movement was fluid and confident, without the hesitation that might have given Donald time to redirect his attack. She simply placed herself in harm's way, her pregnant belly creating a barrier that even Donald's rage could not overcome. "Stop," she said, and her voice carried a quiet authority that cut through the tension like a knife through butter. "He is just a boy, and he is frightened. Beating him will not unbreak those dishes or make him a better cook. It will only make him more afraid, and fear makes people clumsy." The kitchen fell silent except for the creaking of the ship and the distant sound of waves. Donald stood frozen, the spoon still raised above his head, his face a mask of confusion and fury. No one had ever challenged him so directly, so calmly, so completely without fear. The other cooks stared in amazement, hardly believing what they were witnessing. "Get out of my way," Donald said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "This does not concern you." Maria shook her head slowly, her hands resting protectively on her belly. "It concerns all of us," she replied. "We all have to work in this kitchen, and we all deserve to be treated with basic human dignity. You can be a leader without being a tyrant. You can maintain standards without destroying the people who work for you." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Donald felt something he had not experienced in years: uncertainty. This pregnant woman, this nobody who had wandered into his domain just 3 weeks ago, was questioning not just his methods, but his entire philosophy, his very identity as a chef and a leader. The spoon trembled in his hand as he struggled to process this unprecedented act of defiance. "You have no idea what you are talking about," he said finally, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "I have been running kitchens since before you were born. I know what it takes to maintain discipline and order in a place like this." Maria nodded thoughtfully, as if she were genuinely considering his words. "I am sure you do know about discipline and order," she said. "But what about respect? What about creating an environment where people want to do their best work instead of being terrified of making mistakes? What about leading by example instead of ruling through fear?" The confrontation stretched on, neither side willing to back down, while the ship continued to pitch and roll beneath them. Matthew remained frozen between them, his face pale and his hands still bleeding from the broken dishes. Daniel and Brandon watched from the sidelines, hardly daring to breathe as they witnessed this unprecedented challenge to Donald's authority. Finally, Donald lowered the spoon, but his eyes never left Maria's face. "You think you know better than me," he said. "You think you can come into my kitchen and tell me how to run things. Well, let me tell you something, sweetheart. I have seen dozens of people like you over the years. Idealists who think they can change the world with pretty words and good intentions. And do you know what happens to them? They break. They all break, eventually." Maria met his gaze steadily, unflinching in the face of his verbal assault. "Maybe they do," she said quietly, "but maybe that says more about the person trying to break them than it does about their ideas. Maybe the problem is not with people who believe in treating others with dignity. Maybe the problem is with people who think that cruelty is the only way to achieve excellence." The words struck Donald like a physical blow, cutting to the heart of everything he had built his identity upon. For 20 years, he had told himself that his methods were necessary, that the ends justified the means, that the fear and intimidation he employed were simply tools of the trade. But hearing his philosophy challenged so directly, so thoughtfully, by this pregnant woman who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by standing up to him, forced him to confront questions he had been avoiding for decades. The moment passed without violence, but something fundamental had shifted in the kitchen's dynamic. Donald turned away without another word, busying himself with cleaning up the spilled soup and broken dishes. Matthew, still shaking from his narrow escape, mumbled his thanks to Maria and hurried to help with the cleanup. The evening service continued, but the atmosphere had changed in ways that would prove impossible to ignore. Over the following days, Donald found himself watching Maria with a mixture of fascination and frustration. She continued to work with the same quiet efficiency that had marked her first weeks in the kitchen. But now there was an added dimension to her presence. The other cooks began to look to her for guidance and support, turning to her when Donald's temper flared, seeking her calm wisdom when the pressure of service threatened to overwhelm them. This shift in the kitchen's social structure did not go unnoticed by Donald, and it infuriated him in ways he struggled to articulate. His authority, which had once been absolute and unquestioned, now felt tenuous and conditional. The other cooks still obeyed his orders and followed his instructions, but their fear had been tempered by something else, something that Maria had introduced into their cramped domain: hope. Matthew began to stand a little straight toward her, his movements becoming more confident as he realized that Maria's protection extended to all of them. Daniel's stutter began to fade when Donald was not looking directly at him, and he started to volunteer suggestions for improving their efficiency. Even Brandon, who had borne the brunt of Donald's anger for months, began to show signs of his former personality returning. Donald responded to this challenge to his authority in the only way he knew how. He increased the pressure, pushing everyone harder, demanding perfection in every detail, looking for any excuse to reassert his dominance through fear and intimidation. But every time he raised his voice or reached for his wooden spoon, Maria was there, not confrontational but simply present, her quiet strength serving as a reminder that there were other ways to lead, other ways to achieve excellence. The breaking point came during the fourth week, on a particularly busy evening when the ship's passengers had requested an elaborate dinner to celebrate someone's birthday. The kitchen was operating at maximum capacity, with every burner in use and every cook working at the limit of their abilities. Donald prowled through the galley like a caged animal, his stress and frustration building with each passing minute. It was Maria who made the mistake this time, a small error in timing that caused the sauce for the main course to reduce too quickly, becoming thick and slightly burned. In the grand scheme of things, it was a minor problem, easily corrected with a little cream and some careful seasoning. But for Donald, already wound tight with tension and resentment, it was the perfect opportunity to reassert his authority and put this troublesome woman back in her place. The explosion of rage that followed was unlike anything the kitchen had seen before. Donald's voice rose to a roar that could be heard throughout the ship, his words a torrent of profanity and abuse that seemed to go on forever. He accused Maria of incompetence, of arrogance, of thinking she was better than everyone else in the kitchen. He questioned her right to be there, her ability to do the job, even her fitness as a mother for the child she carried. The verbal assault was vicious and personal, designed to strip away every shred of dignity and self-worth that Maria possessed. Donald had perfected this technique over years of practice, knowing exactly which words would cut the deepest, which accusations would hurt the most. He had used it to break stronger people than her, reducing them to sobbing, broken shells of their former selves. But Maria did not break. She stood quietly throughout his tirade, her hands folded over her belly, her eyes never leaving his face. She did not flinch when he stepped closer, did not cower when he raised his voice, did not cry when his words turned cruel and personal. She simply absorbed his anger like a stone absorbing rain, letting it wash over her without being diminished by it. When Donald finally ran out of words, the kitchen fell into a silence so complete that the only sounds were the gentle bubbling of the sauces on the stove and the distant creaking of the ship. The other cooks stood frozen, their eyes wide with shock at the viciousness of the attack they had just witnessed. Even by Donald's standards, this had been extreme, a display of cruelty that crossed lines that should never be crossed. "Are you finished?" Maria asked quietly, her voice steady and calm, despite what she had just endured. "Because we have a dinner service to complete, and these people are depending on us to do our jobs professionally." The simple dignity of her response hit Donald like a slap in the face. Here was a woman who had just been subjected to the worst abuse he could devise, and her first thought was for the work that needed to be done, for the responsibility they all shared to the passengers who were counting on them. It was a level of professionalism and grace that he had never encountered before, and it left him speechless. But Maria was not finished. She stepped closer to him, close enough that she could speak in a voice that would not carry to the other cooks, close enough that her words would be meant for him alone. "I know what you are tracing to do," she said, her voice soft but filled with steel. "You are trying to break me the way you have broken all the others. You think that if you can make me cry, make me quit, make me admit that you are stronger than me, then everything will go back to the way it was before." Donald found himself unable to look away from her eyes, unable to dismiss the quiet authority in her voice. There was no anger there, no hatred, just a clear-eyed understanding of the game they were playing and a determination to change its rules. "But I am not going to break," Maria continued, "and I am not going to let you break them either." She gestured toward Matthew, Daniel, and Brandon, who were watching this exchange with fascination and growing hope. They are good people, and they deserve better than to live in fear of your temper. They deserve to learn and grow and become the best cooks they can be, not spend their days walking on eggshells and waiting for the next explosion. "You do not understand," Donald said, his voice lacking its usual conviction. "You do not understand what it takes to run a kitchen like this. The pressure, the responsibility, the need for perfection. Without discipline, without fear, everything falls apart." Maria shook her head slowly, her expression almost pitying. "I understand pressure," she said. "I understand responsibility. I am carrying a child, and every decision I make affects not just me, but the life growing inside me. I understand the need for excellence, for doing things right the first time. But I also understand that fear and intimidation are not the only ways to achieve those things." She gestured around the kitchen, taking in the scarred surfaces, the dented pots, the atmosphere of barely controlled tension that had defined this space for so long. "Look around you," she said. "Look at what your methods have created. Yes, the food is good. Yes, the service runs smoothly. But at what cost? How many good people have you driven away? How many talented cooks have you destroyed because they could not meet your impossible standards or tolerate your cruelty?" The questions hung in the air between them, forcing Donald to confront truths he had been avoiding for years. He thought about the cooks who had jumped, in various ports, the young men and women who had left his kitchen broken and defeated. He had always told himself that they were weak, that they lacked the strength and determination necessary to succeed in his demanding environment. But now, looking at Maria's calm strength, he began to wonder if perhaps the problem had been with him all along. The dinner service continued around them, but the dynamic in the kitchen had shifted once again. The other cooks worked with a new sense of purpose, inspired by Maria's courage and emboldened by her protection. Matthew's knife work became more confident. Daniel stopped stammering when he spoke, and Brandon began to offer suggestions for improving their efficiency. Even Donald found himself working differently, his movements less aggressive, his voice quieter than usual. As the evening wore on, Donald found himself watching Maria with growing confusion and something that might have been respect. She worked steadily and efficiently, her movements economical despite her advancing pregnancy. When the other cooks needed help, she was there to provide it. When problems arose, she solved them quietly and without fanfare. Most importantly, she did all of this without seeking credit or recognition, content to let others shine while she supported them from the background. It was a style of leadership that Donald had never encountered before, so different from his own approach that he struggled to understand how it could be effective. But effective it was. The kitchen ran more smoothly that night than it had in months. The food was excellent, and the atmosphere, while still tense, lacked the oppressive fear that had characterized it for so long. When the service finally ended and the last dish had been cleaned and put away, Donald found himself alone with Maria in the quiet kitchen. The other cooks had retired to their quarters, exhausted from the long day, but somehow more hopeful than they had been in months. The ship rocked gently beneath them, and the soft light from the oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the walls. "Why?" Donald asked finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "Why do you care so much about them? They are just kitchen help, just temporary workers who will move on to other ships, other jobs. Why risk everything to protect people you barely know?" Maria was wiping down the last of the counters, her movements slow and deliberate. She paused in her work and looked at him with those steady dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "Because everyone deserves to be treated with dignity," she said simply. "Because everyone has the right to learn and grow without being afraid. Because the way we treat others, especially those who have less power than we do, says everything about who we really are." The words hit Donald with unexpected force, cutting through years of justification and rationalization to reach something deep inside him that he had thought was dead. He remembered his own early days in professional kitchens, the fear and humiliation he had endured at the hands of cruel chefs who saw intimidation as a teaching tool. He remembered the young man he had once been, eager to learn, desperate to prove himself, willing to endure any abuse for the chance to master his craft. When had he become the thing he had once feared? When had he decided that the cycle of cruelty was not something to be broken, but something to be perpetuated? When had he stopped seeing the people who work for him as human beings and started seeing them only as tools to be used and discarded when they were no longer useful? "You think I am a monster," he said, and it was not a question but a statement of fact. "You think I am some kind of sadistic tyrant who enjoys making people suffer." Maria finished wiping the counter and turned to face him fully. "I think you are a man who is very good at his job, but who has forgotten that being good at something does not give you the right to destroy other people," she said. "I think you are someone who has been hurt and who has decided that the best way to protect yourself is to hurt others first. I think you are afraid that if you show any kindness, any weakness, people will take advantage of you and everything you have worked for will fall apart." The accuracy of her assessment was startling, and Donald felt exposed in a way that was both uncomfortable and strangely liberating. For years, he had hidden behind his reputation for cruelty, using fear as both a shield and a weapon. But this woman saw through all of that to the frightened, insecure person underneath. And instead of using that knowledge to attack him, she was offering him something he had not experienced in decades: understanding. "But that does not mean you have to stay that way," Maria continued, her voice gentle but firm. "People can change. They can choose to be better than they were before. They can decide that the pain they have experienced does not have to be passed on to others." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside the kitchen. Matthew appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with embarrassment. "I am sorry to disturb you," he said, glancing nervously between Donald and Maria. "But I wanted to thank you, Miss Campbell, for what you did today, for standing up for me. No one has ever done that before." Maria smiled at the young man, and Donald was struck by how the expression transformed her face, making her look younger and more vulnerable, despite the strength she had shown. "You do not need to thank me," she said. "We all need to look out for each other. That is what makes a team work." Matthew nodded eagerly, his relief evident in every line of his body. The fear that had defined his existence in the kitchen was beginning to fade, replaced by something that looked almost like hope. He started to say something else, then glanced at Donald and seemed to lose his nerve. After a moment of awkward silence, he mumbled another thank you and disappeared back into the corridor. The interruption had broken the spell of their conversation. And Donald found himself struggling to process everything that had been said. He had spent so many years defining himself by his reputation for toughness, by his ability to maintain order through fear, that the idea of change seemed almost impossible to contemplate. But something in Maria's words, in her calm certainty that people could choose to be better, had planted a seed of possibility that he could not ignore. The next few days passed in a strange state of suspended animation. Donald continued to run the kitchen with his usual efficiency, but the explosive outbursts and casual cruelty that had marked his previous behavior were notably absent. He found himself watching Maria and the other cooks, observing their interactions, trying to understand how they managed to work together so effectively without the constant threat of punishment hanging over their heads. Maria, for her part, continued to work with the same quiet competence that had marked her time in the kitchen from the beginning. But there was a new confidence in her movements, a sense that she had found her place in this small community and was determined to protect it. The other cooks began to look to her for guidance more and more, turning to her when they had questions or problems, seeking her calm wisdom when the stress of service threatened to overwhelm them. This shift in the kitchen's power structure was not lost on Donald, and it challenged everything he thought he knew about leadership and authority. He had always believed that respect had to be earned through fear, that people would only follow orders if they were afraid of the consequences of disobedience. But Maria commanded respect through her actions, through her willingness to stand up for others, through her quiet competence and unshakable dignity. The test of this new dynamic came during the 5th week, when the ship encountered a severe storm that tested everyone's skills and endurance. The kitchen became a battlefield as pots and pans slid across the floor with each roll of the ship, and the simple act of preparing meals became a dangerous dance with scalding liquids and sharp knives. The normal routine became impossible to maintain, and improvisation became the order of the day. It was during this crisis that Donald saw Maria's true leadership abilities on full display. She moved through the chaotic kitchen like a conductor leading an orchestra, coordinating the efforts of the other cooks, anticipating problems before they occurred, finding solutions to challenges that would have overwhelmed less experienced workers. She did all of this while managing her own advancing pregnancy, which made every movement more difficult and every task more dangerous. When Daniel slipped on a patch of spilled oil and nearly fell into one of the hot stoves, it was Maria who caught him and helped him regain his footing. When Matthew struggled to lift a heavy pot while fighting the ship's motion, she was there to lend her strength despite her condition. When Brandon became overwhelmed by the chaos and started to panic, she calmed him with quiet words and steady presence. Most remarkably, she did all of this without undermining Donald's authority or challenging his position as head chef. She worked within the existing structure, supporting his decisions and implementing his orders. But she did it in a way that protected and encouraged the other cooks, rather than intimidating them. It was a masterclass in collaborative leadership that left Donald both impressed and deeply troubled. As the storm raged outside and the kitchen struggled to maintain some semblance of normal operation, Donald found himself working alongside Maria in a way that felt both natural and revolutionary. They moved together with an efficiency born of shared purpose, each anticipating the other's needs, each contributing their strengths to the common goal of keeping the kitchen running and the crew fed. For the first time in years, Donald experienced the satisfaction of working as part of a team rather than ruling as a tyrant. He felt the energy and enthusiasm that came from people who wanted to do their best work, rather than people who were simply afraid of punishment. He saw how much more could be accomplished when everyone felt valued and supported rather than constantly walking on eggshells. But old habits die hard, and when the storm finally passed and the kitchen returned to its normal routine, Donald found himself slipping back into familiar patterns. The pressure of maintaining his reputation, of living up to the image he had cultivated over decades, proved stronger than his newfound understanding of alternative approaches to leadership. It was during the 6th week that the final confrontation began to build. Donald's internal struggle between his old methods and the new possibilities that Maria had shown him created a tension that seemed to infect the entire kitchen. He would catch himself being unnecessarily harsh with one of the cooks, then overcompensate by being uncharacteristically lenient. He would start to reach for his wooden spoon in anger, then stop himself, leaving everyone confused about what to expect from him. This inconsistency was perhaps worse than his previous predictable cruelty because it created an atmosphere of uncertainty that left everyone on edge. Matthew, Daniel, and Brandon found themselves walking on eggshells again, never sure which version of Donald they would encounter from one moment to the next. Even Maria seemed affected by the tension, her usual calm confidence showing signs of strain as she tried to navigate the increasingly unpredictable environment. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when the ship was making good time across calm seas. The kitchen was preparing for the lunch service, and everything was proceeding normally when Brandon made a simple mistake. He had been assigned to prepare vegetables for the soup, and in his haste to complete the task, he had cut the carrots slightly too large. It was a minor error, easily corrected, the kind of mistake that happens in every kitchen every day. But Donald, already wound tight with internal conflict and frustration, seized on this small imperfection as if it were a personal insult. His reaction was swift and disproportionate, a volcanic eruption of rage that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. He began berating Brandon with a viciousness that exceeded even his previous standards, his voice rising to a roar that echoed through the ship's corridors. "You worthless piece of garbage," he screamed, his face red with fury. "How many times do I have to tell you, people, that precision matters, that consistency matters, that in my kitchen there is no room for sloppy, careless work?" He grabbed the cutting board with the offending carrots and hurled it across the kitchen, sending vegetables flying in all directions. Brandon cowered under the verbal assault, his face white with terror, his hands shaking as he tried to clean up the scattered vegetables. Matthew and Daniel pressed themselves against the walls, their eyes wide with familiar fear. But Maria, who had been quietly working at the other end of the kitchen, slowly turned to face the scene unfolding before her. The sight of this pregnant woman watching his outburst seemed to inflame Donald's rage even further. "And you," he snarled, pointing an accusatory finger in her direction. "This is your fault. Ever since you came here with your high and mighty ideas about dignity and respect, everything has gone to hell. These people think they can get away with anything because they know you will protect them." Maria set down the knife she had been using and walked slowly toward the center of the kitchen, her movements deliberate and controlled. Her pregnancy was now quite advanced, probably 8 months along, and her condition made her seem both vulnerable and powerful at the same time. The other cooks watched in fascination and growing dread, sensing that something momentous was about to happen. "That is enough," Maria said, her voice quiet but carrying clearly through the kitchen. "Brandon made a small mistake that can be easily fixed. There is no need for this kind of reaction." Donald's eyes blazed with fury at this direct challenge to his authority. "No need," he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "No need for standards. No need for discipline. No need for any of the things that make a kitchen function properly. Is that what you think?" "I think there is a difference between maintaining standards and abusing people," Maria replied, her voice steady despite the obvious tension in the room. "I think there is a difference between teaching and terrorizing. And I think you know the difference too, even if you pretend not to." The accusation hit Donald like a physical blow, cutting straight to the heart of his internal struggle. For weeks, he had been wrestling with the questions that Maria's presence had raised, questioning methods and beliefs that he had held for decades. But instead of leading him toward growth and change, this internal conflict had only made him more volatile, more desperate to reassert his authority through the only means he knew. "You think you know everything," he said, his voice taking on that dangerous, quiet tone that always preceded his most vicious attacks. "You think you can waltz in here with your pregnancy and your sob story and tell me how to run my kitchen? Well, let me tell you something, sweetheart. I have been breaking people like you for 20 years, and I will be breaking them long after you and your bastard child are forgotten." The words hung in the air like poison, their cruelty so extreme that even Donald seemed shocked by what he had said. The reference to her unborn child crossed a line that should never be crossed, and everyone in the kitchen knew it. Matthew gasped audibly. Daniel took a step backward as if he had been physically struck, and Brandon stopped cleaning up the scattered vegetables to stare in horror at his boss. But it was Maria's reaction that truly mattered. For the first time since she had entered Donald's kitchen, her calm facade cracked. Her eyes blazed with a fury that matched his own, and her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The insult to her child, to the innocent life she carried, had finally pushed her beyond the limits of her considerable patience and self-control. What happened next would be talked about in shipping circles for years to come. Maria reached for the nearest object at hand, which happened to be a heavy cast iron skillet that had been sitting on the counter beside her. Without hesitation, without a word of warning, she drew back her arm and hurled the pan with all the strength she could muster. The skillet flew through the air with deadly accuracy, spinning end over end as it crossed the kitchen. Donald, still caught up in his own rage, had no time to react before the heavy pain struck him squarely in the forehead with a resounding clang that echoed through the ship like a church bell. The impact sent him staggering backward, blood immediately beginning to flow from the growing lump on his head. "Cook it yourself," Maria said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence that followed the impact. The words were simple, direct, and devastating in their implications. For 20 years, Donald Garcia had terrorized kitchen staff, demanding perfection while offering nothing but abuse in return. Now, for the first time in his career, someone had told him to do the work himself if he was not satisfied with others' efforts. The kitchen fell into a silence so complete that the only sounds were the gentle creaking of the ship and the distant sound of waves against the hull. Donald stood swaying slightly, one hand pressed to his bleeding forehead, his eyes wide with shock and something that might have been fear. The wooden spoon that had been his weapon of choice for so many years lay forgotten on the floor beside him, as useless now as his reputation for invincibility. Maria stood facing him, her chest heaving with emotion and exertion, her hands still clenched into fists. The cast iron pan lay on the floor between them, a symbol of the revolution that had just taken place in this cramped galley. For the first time in his brutal career, Donald Garcia had been challenged not just with words but with action, and the result had left him speechless and bleeding. The other cooks remained frozen in place, hardly believing what they had just witnessed. Matthew's mouth hung open in amazement, Daniel's eyes were wide with shock, and Brandon had stopped pretending to clean up the scattered vegetables to stare at the scene unfolding before him. They had all dreamed of standing up to Donald's tyranny, but none of them had ever imagined it would happen like this, and none of them had ever imagined it would be the pregnant woman who finally brought him down. "You hit me," Donald said finally, his voice filled with disbelief. His hand came away from his forehead, covered in blood, and he stared at it as if he could not quite believe what he was seeing. "You actually hit me." Maria's breathing was beginning to slow, but her stance remained defiant. "I defended myself and my child from your verbal abuse," she replied. "I defended these young men from your cruelty, and I showed you what it feels like to be on the receiving end of violence for once in your miserable career." Donald took a step toward her, then stopped as Maria reached for another pan. The movement was fluid and confident, making it clear that she was prepared to defend herself again if necessary. The sight of this pregnant woman, armed with kitchen equipment and absolutely unafraid of him, was so foreign to Donald's experience that he found himself unable to process it. For 20 years, his reputation had preceded him. Cooks had arrived in his kitchen already afraid, already broken down by stories of his cruelty and violence. They had submitted to his authority before he had even spoken to them, accepting his abuse as the price of working in his domain. But Maria had never been afraid of him, not from the first day she had walked into his kitchen. And now she had proven that his power was not absolute, that his reign of terror could be challenged and defeated. The blood continued to flow down Donald's face as he struggled to find word adequate to the situation. His entire identity was built around his reputation for toughness, for being the man who could break anyone who challenged him. But this pregnant woman had not only refused to be broken, she had struck back with a force that left him reeling both physically and emotionally. "You cannot do this to me," he said finally, his voice lacking its usual conviction. "I am the head chef. I am in charge of this kitchen. You cannot just attack me and expect there to be no consequences." Maria nodded slowly, her grip on the second pan still firm. "You are absolutely right," she said. "There will be consequences. The question is, what kind of consequences you want them to be." The standoff continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Donald stood bleeding and confused, his authority shattered by the simple act of a woman defending herself and others from his abuse. Maria remained ready to fight if necessary, but her eyes held something besides anger now. There was sadness there, and perhaps even pity for the broken man who stood before her. Finally, it was Matthew who broke the silence. He stepped forward slowly, his movements careful and deliberate, and began picking up the scattered vegetables from Brandon's cutting board. His actions seemed to break the spell that had held everyone frozen, and soon Daniel and Brandon joined him, quietly returning the kitchen to some semblance of order. Donald watched this simple act of cooperation with growing amazement. These young men, who had cowered under his authority for months, were now working together without fear, without constant supervision, without the threat of violence hanging over their heads. They moved with confidence and purpose, and there was something in their manner that he had never seen before in his kitchen. They seemed almost happy. Maria slowly set down the pan she had been holding and returned to her workstation. The immediate crisis had passed, but the fundamental change in the kitchen's dynamic was irreversible. Donald's reign of terror was over, ended not by management intervention or crew rebellion, but by the simple courage of a pregnant woman who refused to accept that cruelty was the price of excellence. As the day progressed, Donald found himself working in a kitchen unlike any he had ever known. The other cooks continued to follow his instructions and deferred to his expertise, but the atmosphere of fear that had defined the space for so long was gone. In its place was something that felt almost foreign to him: cooperation, mutual respect, the kind of teamwork that he had always claimed was impossible without the threat of punishment. Maria worked alongside him as if nothing had happened, her movements still careful due to her advanced pregnancy, but her efficiency undiminished. She did not gloat over her victory or try to humiliate him further. She simply went about her work with the same quiet competence that had marked her time in the kitchen from the beginning. But there was a new confidence in her bearing, a sense that she had found her voice and would not be silenced again. The lunch service that day was perhaps the smoothest the kitchen had ever run. Without the constant tension and fear that had characterized their previous work, the cooks found themselves able to focus on their tasks in ways they had never experienced before. Mistakes were corrected quietly and efficiently, problems were solved through collaboration rather than intimidation, and the food that emerged from their efforts was perhaps the best they had ever produced. Donald found himself watching this transformation with a mixture of amazement and something that might have been regret. For years, he had told himself that his methods were necessary, that the fear and intimidation he employed were the only way to maintain standards and achieve excellence. But here was proof that the opposite was true, that people could do their best work when they felt safe and supported, rather than constantly threatened. As the afternoon wore on, Donald began to understand that he stood at a crossroads. He could try to reassert his authority through even greater cruelty, escalating the conflict until someone was seriously hurt or the situation became completely untenable. Or he could accept that his old methods had failed and try to find a new way forward, one that honored the lessons that Maria had taught him about leadership and respect. The choice became clear when he overheard a conversation between Matthew and Daniel during a brief break in the afternoon preparations. The two young men were discussing their plans for the future, talking about the skills they were learning and the careers they hoped to build. For the first time since they had started working in Donald's kitchen, they sounded hopeful about their prospects, excited about the possibilities that lay ahead of them. That is what I took away from them, Donald thought to himself. That hope, that excitement about learning and growing and becoming better at their craft. I turned them into frightened animals instead of helping them become the cooks they could be. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, and he found himself leaning against the counter for support. For 20 years, he had justified his cruelty by pointing to the results he achieved, the smooth operation of his kitchens, the quality of the food he produced. But he had never considered the human cost of those results, the dreams he had crushed and the spirits he had broken in pursuit of his version of perfection. When the dinner service ended and the kitchen had been cleaned and prepared for the next day, Donald found himself alone with Maria once again. The other cooks had retired to their quarters, their voices carrying faintly through the corridors as they discussed the day's events. The ship rocked gently beneath them, and the soft light from the oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the walls. "I owe you an apology," Donald said finally, the words coming out in a rush as if he was afraid he would lose his nerve if he hesitated. What I said about your child was unforgivable. What I have done to all of you, the way I have treated people who came to me wanting to learn, it was wrong. All of it was wrong. Maria looked up from the counter she had been wiping, her expression thoughtful but not unkind. Apologies are a good start, she said, but they do not mean much unless they are followed by real change. The question is not whether you are sorry for what you have done. The question is whether you are willing to do things differently going forward. Donald nodded slowly, understanding that this was his moment of truth. I do not know if I can change, he admitted. I have been doing things the same way for so long that I do not know if I remember how to be different. But I want to try. I want to learn how to be the kind of leader that brings out the best in people instead of destroying them. Maria smiled then, and Donald was struck again by how the expression transformed her face. That is all anyone can ask, she said. The willingness to try, to learn, to be better than you were before. It will not be easy, and you will make mistakes. But if you are genuinely committed to change, then change is possible. Over the following weeks, as the ship continued its journey across the Atlantic, Donald began the difficult process of rebuilding his identity as a chef and a leader. It was not easy work. Decades of ingrained habits and responses had to be unlearned and replaced with new approaches that felt foreign and uncomfortable at first. Maria became his unlikely teacher, showing him through example how to maintain standards without resorting to intimidation, how to correct mistakes without destroying confidence, how to push people to excel while still treating them with basic human dignity. The other cooks, initially suspicious of Donald's apparent transformation, gradually began to trust that the change was real and lasting. The kitchen became a different place entirely, filled with the kind of energy and enthusiasm that comes from people who love their work and feel valued for their contributions. Mistakes were still made, problems still arose, and the pressure of service was still intense. But these challenges were met with collaboration and problem-solving rather than fear and recrimination. When the ship finally reached its destination and the crew prepared to disembark, Donald found himself facing the prospect of returning to the shipping company and requesting assignment to another vessel. But now he would be carrying with him not just his reputation for culinary excellence, but a new understanding of what true leadership meant. Maria, her pregnancy now in its final weeks, prepared to begin a new chapter of her own life. She had proven to herself and others that strength came not from the ability to inflict pain, but from the courage to stand up to those who would abuse their power. Her child would be born into a world where his or her mother had shown that even the most entrenched systems of cruelty could be challenged and changed. As they said their farewells on the dock, Donald found himself struggling to find words adequate to express what Maria had taught him. You saved me, he said finally, not just from myself, but from becoming something even worse than I already was. You showed me that there was another way to live, another way to lead. I will never forget that. Maria adjusted the bundle that contained her few possessions and smiled at the man who had once terrorized her and countless others. We all have the capacity for change, she replied. We all have the choice to be better than we were yesterday. The only question is whether we have the courage to make that choice when the moment comes. As Donald watched her walk away into the bustling crowd of the port city, he understood that his real education was just beginning. The lessons Maria had taught him about leadership, about respect, about the true meaning of strength, would need to be practiced and refined over years to come. But for the first time in decades, he felt hopeful about the future, excited about the possibility of becoming the kind of chef and leader he had always had the potential to be. The story of the pregnant cook who threw a pan at the most feared chef on the Atlantic shipping routes would become legend in the maritime community, told and retold in galley kitchens around the world. But for those who lived through it, the real story was not about violence or confrontation. It was about the power of courage to transform not just individual lives, but entire systems of oppression and abuse. In the end, Maria Campbell had done more than defend herself and her unborn child. She had shown that even the most entrenched patterns of cruelty could be broken, that people could choose to be better than their worst impulses, and that true strength lay not in the ability to dominate others, but in the courage to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. The cast iron skillet that had ended Donald Garcia's reign of terror was eventually melted down and forged into something new, Just as the man himself had been transformed by the courage of a woman who refused to accept that brutality was the price of excellence. And in kitchens across the world, whenever young cooks faced the abuse of tyrannical chefs, they would remember the story of Maria Campbell and find the strength to believe that change was possible, that dignity was worth fighting for, and that even the most powerful bullies could be brought down by someone brave enough to throw the first pan.